The Chessmaster recommends pawn to e3. You move your pawn to e3, which removes the threat on your pawn at c4. Black responds with a castle. You move your queen to b3, which threatens black's bishop at b4 and makes way for a castle to the queen side. Black replies by moving pawn to a5, which removes the threat on black's bishop at b4. You castle, which frees your knight at c3 from the pin. Black answers with bishop captures knight. Your queen captures bishop. Black replies by moving knight to e4, which forks your pawn at f2 and your queen and blocks your pawn at e3. Your bishop takes queen, which attacks black's pawn at c7. Black answers with knight takes queen, which forks your rook at d1 and your pawn at a2. As a result of this sequence of moves, you win a queen and a bishop for a queen and a knight. Additionally, black's attack potential is decreased. Also, the development of your pawns is improved, and black's pawn structure is a little weaker. The Chessmaster recommends queen to b3. You move your queen to b3, which removes the threat on your pawn at c4, attacks black's bishop at b4, and enables the long castle. Black replies by moving pawn to c5, which protects black's bishop at b4. Your pawn at c4 captures pawn. Black responds with the pawn to h6, which threatens your bishop at g5. You move your bishop to d2, which moves it to safety and frees your knight at c3 from the pin. Black responds with pawn at e6, captures pawn. Your pawn takes pawn, which attacks black's bishop at b4 and isolates black's pawn at d5. Black counters with bishop captures pawn. Your knight captures pawn. Black answers with knight captures knight. Your queen takes knight, which pins black's pawn at b7. Black answers with a castle. You move your pawn to e4. Black counters by moving the rook to e8. As a result of this line of play, you win a knight and 3 pawns for a knight and 2 pawns. Additionally, your mobility is enhanced. Also, black's pawn structure is weakened. The Chessmaster recommends queen to b3. You move your queen to b3, which removes the threat on your pawn at c4, attacks black's bishop at b4, and enables the long castle. Black counters with pawn to a5, which protects black's bishop at b4. You move your pawn to e3. Black replies by moving the pawn to h6, which attacks your bishop at g5. Your bishop captures knight, which pins black's pawn at g7 with a partial pin, forks black's pawn at g7 and black's queen, and blocks black's pawn at f7. Black answers with knight takes bishop, which frees black's pawn at g7 from the pin, and protects black's queen and black's pawn at g7. You move your bishop to d3, which enables the short castle. Black counters with pawn to c5. You castle kingside, which frees your knight at c3 from the pin. Black answers with pawn at c5, takes pawn, which attacks your knight at c3. Your pawn at e3 captures pawn, which protects your knight at c3. Black answers with pawn takes pawn, which forks your queen and your bishop and isolates your pawn at d4. Your bishop takes pawn, which protects your queen. Black responds with a castle. As a result of this sequence of moves, you win a knight and 2 pawns for a bishop and 2 pawns. In addition, Black's mobility is slightly decreased. Also, Black's pawn formation is disrupted. Finally, the pressure on your king is eliminated.